Welcome to SAI's South Asia seminar. We have a very interesting event today based on a new book by Amish Raj Mulmi, a journalist, a very distinguished journalist from Nepal. The book is All Roads Lead North, Nepal's turn to China. So historically and civilizationally, Nepal has always turned south towards its giant neighbor India. But in sort of recent years, there's been some significant shifts, and partly it's explained by the extraordinary rise of China, partly by the domestic politics within Nepal itself, and partly to do with how India-Nepal relations have evolved and the history behind it in the last half century. To help us understand these very complex changes and its implications, we have this amazing new book by Amish, and I'll turn it over to him to enlighten us. So Amish, it's sort of yours now.
Thank you, Professor Kapoor. Thank you, SAIS, for having me over. Let me just share my screen. We'll just start with a small presentation. All right, everyone can see my screen. So I'd like to start by making one of the key arguments that I make in my book is that Nepal's recent affinity with China is built upon its history of trade, shared religion, and cultural linkages with Tibet. Of course, China's growing ambitions in recent years and upheavals in the global power contest have brought new attention to Nepal's growing proximity to China. But Nepal has also long desired the counterbalance of China in its relations with India. It was only after infrastructure gains in Tibet that China could provide more than just moral support to Nepal. However, we must remember that China turned Nepal's immediate neighbor only in 1950. Until then, it was Tibet that was next door. So Nepal has had classical links with China too, the most famous being Erniko, a 13th century craftsman and architect who rose to a high position at the Kublai Khan's court. But primarily to our understanding of Nepal's links with the North is that it was built upon hundreds of years of exchanges via trade and religion. Now, what were these ties like? A lot of it was built upon Buddhism and trade. Now, until the middle of the 18th century, the Goloka Expansion, when the Goloka Expansion changed geopolitical and trade realities in the Himalaya, Nepal and Tibet shared a very sort of an interesting link between religion built on religion and trade. Nepal minted coins for Tibet until the 19th century because of a 16th century treaty between Nepal and Tibet. Tibetan monks used to upkeep Nepali Buddhist stupas. Nepali traders lived in Lhasa for a long period of time, for years at a stretch. Now, this is beyond the ethnic, familial, and cultural ties that existed and exist between Nepal's Himalayan communities and Tibet. Trans-Himalayan trade occurred at almost all possible passes. Whether in the east, you have Olangchung, in central Nepal, you have Mustang, in the west, you have Humla, and further. Salt, gold, yak tails, wool were carried in from Tibet, grains, consumer goods, other essentials were carried across. Some interesting consumer goods such as Parker pens, Rolex watches, jewelry was sent across from Calcutta to Lhasa. In the 1940s, I believe the Karmapa had asked for a Rolex watch from a noted Newar trader known as Shamu Kapu, who delivered it from Calcutta. Now, Calcutta had been a center after Young Husband opened the route after the 1903 British invasion of Tibet. So the Newar traders who used to earlier travel from Kuti and Kerun shifted their business to Calcutta. They used to go to Calcutta where they used to import goods, and via Kalimpong and the Sikkimese passes, they used to go on into Tibet. Now, such trade came to an end with the securitization of the Himalaya when China arrived in Tibet. This is an interesting thing. One of the key questions that I've been tackling in my book is what was the situation in the Himalaya after China arrived in Tibet? Now we learn that the PRC, the People's Republic of China, faced several dilemmas. One of the key dilemmas was the question of citizenship itself. Now, in Lhasa, Neva traders from Kathmandu lived years at a stretch. You had herders from Ladakh, you have Muslim traders from Central Asia. All of them lived without any sort of, let's say, they had documentation, but it was not modern documentation. So the question of citizenship was a key issue that confronted the Chinese when they arrived in Tibet. Who belonged where? Immediate changes could be seen. Nepal traders could now require passports to travel across borders. Earlier, Nepali traders used to send money back home via Indian or British banks. Now Chinese banks were required to transfer money. Citizenship could no longer be ambiguous in the Himalaya, as they always had been. As scholar Salman Wasif Khan has said, the PRC was changing what life in the borderlands had historically meant. People would now have to be part of the state. Further, what we had was when the Tibetan uprising occurred and the war with India happened in 1962, it forced China to securitize the Himalaya even furthermore. Now, despite this, the PRC's control over the Himalayan borderlands would still be relatively ungovernable till the first years of the 21st century. One of the instances of this border ambiguity could be seen in August 1960, when PLA soldiers killed a Nepali soldier and imprisoned others. This was an instance of where the border itself was, since the Nepal-China border had not been demarcated at the time and was determined upon traditional boundary markers. Another reason for China's dilemma in the Himalaya was a very interesting Cold War intrigue, where armed Tibetan guerrillas in the Nepal Himalaya waged war against godless Chinese communists encouraged by the CIA. Starting from the late 1950s onwards, what we had was the CIA was encouraging armed resistance against Chinese rule. After the Tibetan uprising, and by the early 1960s, the Chushi Gangruk, as it's known, the resistance force, came to be centered in Nepal. One of the centers was Mustang on the trans-Himalayan region of Mustang, but there were nearly 2,000 Tibetan guerrillas who lived in several war camps scattered across Nepal's Himalaya regions. What we had was there were very few successes. There was one success in about 1961-62 when the armed Tibetan guerrillas recovered a bunch of documents that told the world about the failures of the Great Leap Forward. The second was more of a, let's say, a great PR sort of exercise when Scottish missionary George Patterson recorded a Tibetan raid on a PLA convoy. However, by the late 1960s, the US had started reaching out to China, which meant that the CIA would start winding up its funding of the armed resistance program. By 1974, the new Nepal King Birendra authorized the military operation against the guerrillas. Most surrendered, a few escaped, only to be killed at a pass on the Nepal-India-China border. Now, after the 1974 operations, Nepal and UNHCR asked the American State Department about whether they could assist with the rehabilitation of the armed guerrillas. The State Department said that it had no moral duty, which I quote, and that it refused to assist with the rehabilitation. Nonetheless, there were further dilemmas that came from the Tibet question for China. Now, after the operation against the Tibetan guerrillas, most upper Nepali Himalayan regions were barred for foreigners until the 1990s, when they could travel with a strict permit. But after the 1959 uprising itself, Tibetan refugees had begun settling in Nepal. China had largely ignored them till protests flared up in Tibet in the mid-1980s. Now, these Tibetan refugee camps have been funded by the Red Cross. They set up handicraft and carpet factories to make the camps self-sufficient. Most Tibetan refugees I spoke to said that they did not have problems setting up businesses in Nepal till in the early 1990s. But once Tibet again started getting restive in the mid-1980s onwards, China began to apply pressure, both on the movement of refugees across the border, as well as on Tibetans living inside Nepal. In 1991, the Dalai Lama canceled his visit to Lumbini after Chinese protests to Nepal. In 1999, the Karmapa, who's one of the, I believe he's the second or the third highest ranking Lama in the Tibetan Buddhist hierarchy, he escaped via the border that we had just seen, the Mustang border that we had just seen. The Mustang border was fenced after that border unilaterally. It continues to be fenced. In the late 1990s, the Maoist civil war picked up, and Nepal became more involved with that. China also became more engaged with its own economic growth. So there's little sort of exchanges. But when the Maoist civil war intensified, King Gyanendra declared an emergency in February 2005. Now, India, the UK, and the US, who were Nepal's primary defense suppliers, refused to supply it weapons. But China agreed, especially when Nepal shut down the Dalai Lama's offices in Kathmandu in 2005. The monarchy had long engaged with China. China considered it its permanent friend. And this was a sort of a quid pro quo wherein King Gyanendra shut down the Dalai Lama's offices, and China in turn supported his, let's say, his takeover, as well as his war on the Maoists. Now, we come to 2008. I believe 2008 to be a turning point in how Nepal and China relations have evolved. On the left, we see a picture. This is a picture of the Tibetan protest that broke out in March 2008 till May 2008 against the Beijing Olympics in Kathmandu. On the right is a picture of Prachanda, who met Hu Jintao at the Beijing Olympics closing ceremony. The Maoists had emerged over ground a few years earlier and emerged as the largest political force in Nepal. So what happened was these massive anti-Beijing Olympic protests broke out in Kathmandu for 2 months, and China believed that the Nepal government, which at the time was being led, the interim Nepal government, which was being led by the Nepali Congress, was not considered to its interests. So it began engaging with other political actors on a wide scale. Further, after the declaration of the Republic, China needed new friends within the Nepali establishment, which is why it began to engage with Maoists and the Nepali security establishment. In 2009, the Maoists alienated India by trying to fire the army chief. India then engineered an anti-Maoist coalition to prevent the former rebels from coming to power. And Indian interests now came to be identified, particularly with Maudisi demands of federalism and wider representation. Such political management alienated the Kathmandu establishment as well as the political establishment. What was happening here was that China's engagement with Maoists was built both on a long-standing Maoist desire as well as to fill up the vacuum Beijing found itself in after the end of the monarchy. Primary to this was, of course, to halt Tibetan activism inside Nepal, but of course, China also needed new friends. So in the years between 2008 to 2015, what was happening was that India was actively sort of trying to manage the politics inside Nepal. The Maoists trying to come back to power because there was still a significantly large political force. The Nepali Congress was trying to cobble together a sort of a coalition to come to power. So in 2013, the first Constitution Assembly lapsed. There was another election. This time, the Maoists did not perform too well. Nonetheless, in coalition governments that were made. In 2015, April, Nepal suffered a massive earthquake. Now, the 2015 constitution was promulgated in its aftermath. At the time, it was believed that the lack of a constitution had delayed relief and reconstruction works. So 3 major parties agreed upon the statute, the Nepali Congress, the UML, and the Maoists. But at the same time, violent protests broke out in the plains of Nepal against what they saw as a constitution that did not guarantee their representation or agreed to their demands about state restructuring. The US, China, and other Western countries and agencies welcomed the constitution. India stood out in this regard. So what happened was there were massive protests in the south of Nepal. India then said, because of the security concerns, because of security reasons, it halted the movement of cargo and fuel trucks. So it never said it had imposed a blockade. So in Nepal, it's called an unofficial blockade. India says that it did not impose a blockade. But nonetheless, the move was seen as a coercive measure to get Kathmandu to agree to Indian demands. Now, Oli, who was the prime minister at the time, he reached out to China and he signed a petroleum supply agreement, breaking India's monopoly of supply. At that time, China sent about 10 odd petroleum trucks, which is mostly symbolic than anything else. But what the petroleum trucks did was cemented Oli's desire to break away from India's economic stranglehold. Now, although Oli's government fell in 2016, the two interim governments under Prachanda and Deoba that came after him, Prachanda and Sher Bahadur Deoba of the Congress, signed more agreements with China. Nepal then became part of One Belt, One Road. Then it was called, now it's called the Belt and Road Initiative in May 2017. In December 2017, elections, the first federal elections happened in Nepal. Oli pitched himself as a nationalist leader who would deliver prosperity and development. The UML emerged as the largest party in this election. Oli was the leader of the UML at this time, and the Maoists were now third. But the Maoists and Oli and the UML had already announced before the elections that they would merge the two parties to form the NCP. So what happened after the 2015 blockade was you had a sort of a narrative building up that India's blockade had forced Nepal into China's arms. You've seen some of these reports at the time, you can see on the left. But at the same time, this engagement also meant that there were a variety of other sort of influxes from China that were coming in terms of, let's say, investment, as you can see on the right. Since 2015, China has been the largest foreign investor in Nepal. China has sent the largest number of foreign tourists. China has taken the lead in earthquake reconstruction projects. And China has also taken the lead in infrastructure projects. Nepal's turn to China became more visible in this period after 2015. Apart from these infrastructure deals, you had trade and transit agreements allowing Nepal to use Chinese ports, both seaports and land ports. You had Nepali border points in the north, Mustang, Grasua, Tatabani, Hilsa, etc. 6 points have been earmarked for future development of a north-south economic corridor across Nepal. Now, the key question over here is we have to look at from two sides. The first is, what did China do right in this period? My argument is that China kept sight of its priorities during this tricky post-conflict period. Now, its priority was to clamp down on Tibetan activism at the beginning. So it did that while allowing India and other countries to take the lead and be visible in the post-conflict peace process. It made friends across the board. It engaged the security establishment and the bureaucracy via aid, training programs, etc., as well as the political class. It emphasized the importance of Nepal in China's worldview. In 2010-2011, the army chief, the internal security chief, and the Prime Minister Wen Jiabao visited Nepal, the latter only for 5 hours, but all 3 visits increased aid and grants to Nepali security establishment as well as to Nepal. In contrast, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi visited Nepal in 2014 after his election. It was the first by an Indian Prime Minister in 17 years. Now, we also have to remember that China's growing ambitions in South Asia also sort of were more visible at this time, as well as its infrastructure progress in Tibet. In 2006, the Cinghai Tibet Railway opened, and you had a high-speed railway connection to Tibet. You had massive infrastructure development in terms of roads, so which allowed Beijing to cross this Himalayan barrier in a way which was not possible in previous years. In fact, Deng Xiaoping in 1975 had told American President Gerald Ford that perhaps China could do more with Nepal once its train to Tibet was accomplished. In 2013, Xi Jinping also highlighted a new neighborhood policy in which he emphasized on increased people-to-people contact, increased cultural exchanges, as well as security cooperation with all neighboring countries. At the same time, how has Nepal sort of responded to this new China that is coming up on its northern frontier? This new found affinity to China could only be possible because of Chinese infrastructure gains in Tibet. We have to remember that the 2015 unofficial blockade was not the first time India has imposed a blockade on Nepal. It had imposed one in 1962, as well as in 1989. In 1989, was the most recent one, Nepal had decided to import anti-aircraft weapons from China, and that was one of the key reasons why India imposed the blockade. But at that time, Nepal had could only make do with Chinese moral support. That was the key difference between the 1989 and the 2015 blockade. In 2015, Nepal found China willing to assist with petroleum infrastructure and the possibility of an economic decoupling from India. Nepali aspirations from the Chinese were now wide-scale, but key to it was also a traditional belief among the Kathmandu elite and local population that China has been a better neighbor to Nepal than India, and that China had Nepali interests in mind. With the Nepali Communist Party, the merged party of the UML and the Maoists now in power, the merger was said to have been encouraged by Beijing. It's not yet been confirmed, but that's one of the let's say, what's been going on in Kathmandu. The transformations were visible in a starker way. One example I want to give you is in Rasua, which is the key land border at the moment with China. In a stretch of 24 kilometers from the Nepal border inland to Nepal, China is building a dry port, it's upgrading the highway, it's built a border bridge, and it's building a hydropower project. In Pokhara and Bhairava, two important cities, international airports are being built by Chinese contractors. Chinese contractors have built irrigation projects in Nepal, and an SEZ, a Special Economic Zone, has been promised in KP Oli's constituency in eastern Nepal. At the same time, as seen in a previous slide, Chinese investments have been increasing in Nepal massively. These sectors, the sectors that these Chinese have been interested in are in tourism, in cargo shipments, mining, hydropower, petroleum exploration. What's happened above all, in my personal argument, is that it's Nepal's tourism that has reoriented itself for the Chinese visitor. Because between 2009 and 2019, you had a five-fold jump in number of Chinese tourists visiting Nepal. This sort of proximity, this sort of let's say newfound affinity to China was also reflected in its politics. The CCP entered Nepal officially in September 2019. What we had was the CCP and the NCP exchanged agreements on a tie-up. Now, the NCP-CCP tie-up is predicated on the Chinese understanding that communists are Nepal's primary political force. Its officials had earlier called for Nepali political parties to unite in the past, including its foreign minister. Now that this agreement was signed, NCP cadres were to be trained in Xi Jinping thought. In October 2019, Xi Jinping visits Kathmandu for about 24 hours, but this visit was seen as the ultimate culmination of NCP and CCP warmth and the warm ties between Nepal and China. Nepal had long wanted Xi Jinping to visit the country. A visit in 2016 was cancelled, a proposed visit was cancelled after Oli's government was brought down by Prachanda. Now, in recent years, what we have to also remember is that the US-China war of words that could be seen in 2019 and later during the pandemic, the trade war, all of that, it could be seen in Nepal much earlier. It began from Mike Pompeo, who was Secretary of State at that time, his statement in 2018 that Nepal was part of the free and open Indo-Pacific because of its agreement with the Millennium Challenge Cooperation Compact, or the MCC. And Nepal had agreed to be a part of the MCC grant in 2014, but it was only in 2018 that the MCC was said to be part of the Indo-Pacific, which is a security doctrine. Now, this statement left its impact in domestic politics. Oli had been accusing the Speaker of the Parliament of not allowing the passage of the MCC in Parliament, which the MCC needs to be ratified by Parliament for it to become an act, and Oli accused the Speaker of not allowing it to be passed. The first signs of the discord came through because of this. During the pandemic, in June 2020, a virtual interaction between NCP and the CCP also highlighted the role of MCC when Prachanda said Nepal would not be part of any program with a security component. Now, there had been a war of words between American and Chinese representatives in Nepal. The US Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense of South Asia, Joe Felter, he basically compared MCC to BRI and the Sri Lankan debt trap. And I quote, "The Chinese investments in Nepal must serve Nepali interests, not Chinese." A day later, the Chinese ambassador said his comments were irresponsible. Nonetheless, all of this was happening. There were strains within the NCP also showing. Now in November 2019, the new Indian political map showed Kalapani, which is a sliver of triangular sliver of land in the west of Nepal that Nepal considers its own. Nepal protested the new map. In May 2020, when India announced it was building a road via the same territory, India-Nepal relations went into deep freeze. There's a war of words. Our prime minister said things, our deputy prime minister said things, Indian chief ministers and other officials said things. The Indian army chief said Nepal had protested at someone else's behest, implying that China was behind the move. Now, the June 2020 Ladakh violence furthered this India-China contest inside Nepal, obviously, for obvious reasons. There was an increased focus on on how India-China contest would have ramifications within Nepal. But at the same time, there had been a sort of, as seen earlier, there had been a strain within the NCP also boiling up. Nepali domestic politics has been notoriously partisan and even more unpredictable, if I may say. An anti-Oli faction had been growing inside the NCP because of his support to the MCC, but this is just one of the reasons. The other reasons were that he had a preference for ordinances and to capture executive power and state institutions. And he had supposedly had a power sharing deal with Prachanda, wherein he would become prime minister for 2.5 years and then give up the seat for Prachanda. And supposedly that didn't work out. So Oli and Prachanda were both chairman of the Nepal Communist Party, and Oli refused to give up the chairmanship when basically the other leaders asked him to have one post. Now at this time, most interestingly, the Chinese ambassador Hu Yanqi made several rounds of the NCP leaders. This is during the pandemic. But this was the first time that the Chinese ambassador had done the rounds of Nepali politicians. The Chinese interest in preserving NCP unity was now widely known. What we are not sure about yet was whether it was because China was comfortable in its position in Nepal and wanted its ambitions to be visible, or whether it was because Beijing was yet to understand the fractious nature of Nepali politics. Nonetheless, these round of meetings led to an increased scrutiny on the Chinese in Nepal. Nonetheless, despite all of this, despite Beijing's preference for a unified NCP, KP Oli made it clear he was willing to split the party. He reached out to India, which sent its foreign secretary, its army chief, and its external intelligence chief to Kathmandu. It is a sign that relations had emerged from the deep freeze of Kalapani. China was now on the back foot. In December 2020, Oli dissolved the parliament. That decision was revoked in February 2021. A few weeks later, the Supreme Court then decided that the NCP itself the unification was not a valid one, so it broke up the unification as well. So we are currently in that stage where there is a sort of a domestic political impasse about who supports whom. It's a game of numbers right now. What I want to sort of come back to is, I want to sort of conclude by taking us back through what happened in this past decade. How did China make headway in Nepal? Post 2008, we can now divide it in 3 phases. The first phase was to reduce Tibetan activism and increase its political engagement in Nepal after the monarchy, at a time when it had also begun to display its desire for a greater say in global and regional affairs. Now, in this period, it succeeded to a large degree in Nepal. Tibetan activism was silenced. It expanded its engagement with both the political class as well as the government establishment inside Nepal to align to its interests. The second phase is what I identify as 2013 to 2019, when Xi Jinping's neighborhood policy provides a sort of a directive. China now begins to emerge as an alternative to Indian political and economic hold over Nepal. China becomes more visible with its aid and grant projects. It builds a training academy for the armed police force. It expands the Kathmandu Ring Road. It deepens political engagement as seen with ties between the NCP and the CCP. And the Xi Jinping visit was obviously the culmination of these warm ties. Yale scholar Christina Seyfield has argued in terms of Chinese influence in Africa that China filled the void in Africa in terms of economic investments. I'll argue that China filled the void in Nepal, not economically as in Africa, as much as politically. China's investments in Nepal are yet to touch the scale of even other South Asian countries like Sri Lanka and Bangladesh. So what China provides in the country is a sort of a political alternative. From the third phase actually starts from 2020 onwards, where this is a phase in which China has suffered a setback. There is increased scrutiny on China and Nepal. The US-China contest is obviously being amplified in smaller nations, and we can see it here as well. I'll come to that in a bit. The China-India contest is obviously happening, showing its strains in Nepal as well, because India will always be a leading player in Nepal. At the same time, China has succeeded in getting Nepal to align itself to the international Chinese narrative on Xinjiang, on Hong Kong, on COVID. Nepal has supported China's line, and as well as the recent declaration, the joint declaration of Everest's new height, which I argue is also important to China in its quest for a new international narrative. There are hints in recent weeks that China may be willing to decouple its economic investments from its political influence, but it's too early to say whether it's policy or a one-off fact. But at the same time, what recent events have made clear is that China's policy of putting eggs in one basket in Nepal, earlier it was the monarchy and then the communists, can be a flawed template. In a cacophonous and a contentious domestic polity like Nepal, where partisanship rules, broader engagement with all parties could be a better approach. But because of the 2020 border dispute in Western Nepal, what happened was that China was accused of encroaching upon Nepali territory in Western Nepal in the Himalaya. And a lawmaker of the Nepali Congress has been accusing the party of China of encroaching upon Nepali land. So the Chinese embassy wrote a scathing letter to the Nepali Congress, which is the chief opposition party in Nepal. And the question is now, can it repair ties and reach out to other political parties in the country as well? Now, when we talk about China and Nepal in the 21st century, there are a few things that are already clear. The first is that China has already made space for itself in Nepal. And I don't believe that once China will not let go of such space so easily. Its primary objectives, the securitization of the Himalayan border to halt the movement of Tibetans and quelling Tibetan activism inside Nepal, have been achieved. Its recent agreements, when Xi Jinping visited, China had proposed an extradition treaty with Nepal. Nepal refused to sign it. But in lieu of the extradition treaty, China and Nepal now have a border management system treaty and a mutual legal assistance treaty. The border management system treaty sort of allows China nationals from citizens of both countries, to be returned to each other's countries if they've been found to cross over illegally. The mutual legal assistance treaty is a sort of where if let's say Chinese nationals have committed crime in Nepal, they can be sent back to China, as we saw in November 2019, when about 120 Chinese nationals were sent back to China from Nepal for committing cyber crimes from Nepal. China's South Asian ambitions via Nepal have also been seen. Now, one of these is the train. Now, the train is predicated on the access to North Indian markets. Whether that's going to happen or not, it's still not sure, especially because India, China obviously have recently not been on very good terms. But at the same time, China has also been developing a special economic zone in eastern Nepal to supply and export goods to South Asian markets. Now, despite these recent setbacks, China's South Asian ambitions will continue to grow from here. Now, Nepal has also joined the Chinese narrative, as I had said earlier. Now, China values this and Nepal perceives this as important. At the same time, we've also seen that China is more than willing to take unilateral decisions. It has closed the borders unilaterally, especially in Humla during the COVID pandemic, when so a lot of Humla residents would cross over into Tibet, in Taklagod, to work or to work as labor or to run shops, restaurants. They've not been allowed to cross over since the pandemic. The trade points, especially the Raswagari trade point, has been closed. Some traders have accused China of imposing an undeclared blockade. At the same time, China has also sort of pushed vaccine diplomacy in a way that it has pushed its vaccine diplomacy, but it has not been seen to be taking the lead. In fact, the Chinese grant of 800,000 vaccines only just arrived about 10 days ago, and the vaccine will start being used from tomorrow onwards. But the Indian vaccines had long before arrived in Nepal. And finally, China has emphasized on new investments, on $30 billion investments in Tibet in this new 2021 to 2025 5-year plan. Now, these infrastructure investments will affect Nepal as well. The train will finally reach the border. We don't know whether it will reach beyond that, but Nepal certainly hopes so. And obviously, Himalayan communities in our side of Nepal have been taking advantage of Tibet's infrastructure and urban growth. At the same time, now I come to this thing called the other view. What is India's position and what is the American position in Nepal right now? India, to a large degree, it seems to have reoriented its Nepal policy, but it's unclear to which degree has it been reoriented to. It's interesting that India has shown a willingness to engage with the Oli government, despite the recent freeze and ties. Even when the parliament was suspended, India invited the Nepali foreign minister to come over to come to Delhi for minister level talks, which Nepal had been asking for a long time. So the question is, has India now started keeping its long-term interests in mind and shown a willingness to engage with any government in Nepal that is in power? At the same time, we also see India has begun focusing on broader infrastructure connectivity and people-to-people ties post-2015. There's been a lot of post-earthquake reconstruction and schools, new petroleum pipelines. One was inaugurated from Raxaul to Amletganj, I believe last year or so. Another one is in the works in the eastern side. The highway upgradation handover just recently happened in the plains of Nepal. India had upgraded Nepali highways. And recently the Kathmandu-Raxaul train, which is sort of seen as a counter to the Lhasa to Kathmandu train, has begun making much more progress, especially with reports that India might be willing to pay for the Kathmandu-Raxaul train on its own. In vaccine diplomacy, India took the lead. Nepal was one of the first countries to receive Indian vaccines as aid. Nepal has been relying on Covishield that the Serum Institute in India has been making. But the question remains that we are still unsure what are the new red lines vis-a-vis China in Nepal, from India's perspective. Earlier, it would be said that China, the red line for India was for China to cross the Himalayan border, which it did that in the 1960s. But thereafter, then it was that China would not come into the plains, which that has also happened. So do we see any new red lines vis-a-vis China and Nepal? And the larger question is Indian foreign policy itself witnessing a reorientation under Narendra Modi? Now, when we come to the US, it's a very interesting position the US found itself in December. It did not approve of Oli's parliament dissolution, but it did not disapprove of it either. The future of MCC is in doubt. It has to be ratified in parliament. The foreign minister yesterday said in parliament that the MCC continues to be tabled in parliament, but there has been no movement on it. So I don't know what's happening on that. The US also had been putting out its position on MCC before the parliament dissolution happened. The US has been relatively quiet on the MCC after Oli's dissolution of parliament. The key question here is the US has also implemented a new Tibet Policy and Support Act, under which it will be giving, I believe, around $6 million a year from till 2025 to Tibetan communities in India and Nepal for cultural upkeep. There's a lot of that, but there's a curious sentence in that act that says the money is also intended to educate the next generation of Tibetan leaders. So what are the implications of Nepal via this? And finally, the question also is, under this new presidency, will American policy on South Asia change, or will American policy on South Asia focus solely on reducing Chinese influence while acknowledging the Indian leadership in the region and allowing India to take the lead according to the whole Indo-Pacific strategy? finally, I think the key when we think about Nepal and China in the years to come, there are a lot of unknowns, especially because Nepali politics itself is in a let's say impasse at the moment. But one thing is for sure is that China is here to stay. Now the key will be for Nepal to identify where it can work with China despite the larger geopolitical turbulence and the India-China and the US-China contest. And similarly with India. India has obviously been a long, let's say, partner to Nepal. And in terms of, as I said, post 2015, there has been a change in its orientation towards Nepal. So if it continues on that approach, do we think that Delhi will give up on, let's say, having a government that is more amenable to its interests in Nepal? We don't know. So these are questions that are still evolving, and let's see in the years to come how it develops. Thank you so much. I will stop my sharing at that. Yes.
Thank you, Amish. That was a very comprehensive sort of analysis of a fascinating but complex sort of issue. Just for everyone who is sort of listening, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A function, and I'll look at them and sort of read them out to Amish. Amish, let's just sort of start with where you ended, which is the evolution of Nepali politics. One thing that be good to hear from you is, what is the weight and the evolution of especially the Madhesis? I gather it's roughly about a third of the population, but you would have.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
My understanding of Nepalese politics is that high politics in Nepal has always been controlled by the political elites from the hills. And the Madhesis have, that was part of the whole struggle of the constitution, of the relative rights of the Madhesis and so on. So one is both within the in South Asia, communist parties have been known to be notoriously fractious. In Bengal, there were 8 factions. Kerala, there's Maoist, Leninist, Stalinist, you name it. What is the future both you see of Nepalese politics with the Madhesis? We haven't talked of where the Nepalese Congress Party is now. Do you see a realignment happening? Is the personality clash between Oli and Prachanda just now too profound for a reconciliation? Because it's likely that a lot will depend, really. The second is, you also ended by saying, in the past, it was always the narrative in Nepal was whatever happened was somehow the hidden hand of India was sort of shaping things. But now the very growth of China's presence in Nepal has meant that it is seen as the hidden hand, and sometimes not so hidden hand. So, that's the flip side of being so important, is that now you get blamed for, even if you are not sort of responsible. If you could to give us a sort of your sense of the evolution of Nepal's politics and these complex players between the NCP, the factions of the Communist Party, and the Madhesis, because that is likely to sort of affect the relations with the neighbors.
So it's with Madhesi representation, there's an interesting turn that's happening in recent politics. What's happening is that there's a party called the Janta Samajwadi Party, which is Baburam Bhattarai, one of the ex-Maoists. He merged with the Madhesi parties of Upendra Yadav and Mahanta Thakur. And they hold about 34, 35 seats in the parliament right now, and they've turned out to be a kingmaker. So it's a very interesting position where Oli knows that he doesn't have the numbers in the House, but the opposition, those who are against him, have not brought a no confidence motion against him. Now, everyone currently is out to make alliances. What's happening today? In fact, I was just reading before this presentation that the Jasapa, the JSP, the Jasapa, what we call it in Nepal, one of the leaders was asked Nepali Congress leader Sherbadu Deuba to come up with a proposal that if you want to unseat Oli, come to us. We are willing to talk. But Deuba has not shown a willingness. On the other side, Oli is also engaging with the Jasapa in terms of, so several criminal cases have been registered against Jasapa leaders for the violent protests in the aftermath of the constitution. One of them was Resham Chaudhary, the Tharu leader, who's still in jail for the alleged murder of police forces in Western Nepal, far Western Nepal. So one of the deals that the Jasapa is also looking forward to make is the release and the cancellation of the criminal charges against its leaders. So Madhesi representation, how it will come to be seen in the larger politics, well, unless there are another elections, there will be what it is. Like in province number 2, they hold the party, they run the state, but provincial powers have been severely curtailed by Oli during his term. But it'll be interesting to see how the Jasapa, let's say, aligns itself, whether with Oli or whether against Oli, and how that will chart. My sense is that alliance, whichever side Jasapa goes to, will also shape the future of, let's say, Madhesi representation in Nepal as well. Now, as to the second question about whether the NCP factions, whether they can align again, it's like you said, I mean, communist parties in South Asia are notoriously factional. So it is in the immediate future, it looks like those within the UML who are opposed to Oli, which is primarily Madhav Kumar Nepal, which is Jhalanath Khanal, they will probably leave the party. But whether they will join the Maoists as it is, or the Maoists will have to, under Prachanda, they will have to start a new party, that is still not known. I doubt Madhav Kumar Nepal and Jhalanath Khanal will join a party that calls itself Maoists. So the Maoists have to change the name somehow or the other. I don't see a realignment with Oli, the factions have been, the party has been split, let's say, vertically. So you have Oli on one side, and you have Prachanda, you have Madhav Kumar Nepal, and Jhalanath Khanal on the other side. So it's being split vertically. I doubt whether Oli will come back to align with, let's say, Madhav Kumar Nepal and Jhalanath Khanal. Now, as the third thing about China as the hidden hand and how it's being seen, it's very interesting. Since in December 2020, before the dissolution happened, the split was clear that the ILD had sent across a high-ranking team, and I believe the media report suggested that the high-ranking CCP team first asked whether the split could be averted. If the split could not be averted, would China's interest in Nepal be guaranteed even after the split? And it is believed, like media reports have said, that Nepali leaders have assured China their interests will be assured despite the split. So, as I said earlier, that perhaps it's a time for China to, just sit back and sort of think about its larger interests, because political management in Nepal, I don't think was its primary interest to begin with. So it's fine. It's found itself in an interesting and a curious position. I argue in my book that it's pretty much the same position how India found itself in earlier years, about as being seen as a kingmaker. And like you said, that the more visible you are, the more brickbats also you'll get at the same time. So yeah, it's really, like I said, how the situation evolves, it's such a fluid situation right now that you really can't say how it will evolve from here on. So
I'll do one more follow-up question and then we'll open it up. So one of the things is, of course, that the landscape in Asia, the strategic landscape in Asia has been changing quite rapidly. Obviously, the elephant in the room is the spectacular rise of China. As you might have sort of noticed, an institution that was pretty dormant, if not absent, is being resuscitated, which is the Quad. The sort of Australia, US, Japan, India. Now, to the extent that rivalries sharpen, smaller countries are bound to come under greater pressure. What's interesting is for decades, one of Nepal's biggest donors has been Japan. And Japan usually plays a much more low-key role in terms of having any political pressures and so on. But now, as being part of the Quad, you see the Japanese linking up with US and India. In Myanmar is a very good example, so-called counter China. How do you see this sort of groupings now emerging and leaving Nepal and its leadership with much more difficult choices than in the past? Or do you actually see Nepal's leaders being adept at being able to play all sides and being able to get even more? Because it could go either way.
Yeah. No, with Japan's role, I think it's an interesting query because it's even in South Asia, when India and Japan had been, let's say, coming together, as we see in Bangladesh or let's say in Sri Lanka, somehow India and Japan had never come together in Nepal. Japan has primarily been seen as a bilateral aid partner, a very, very important aid partner. But I doubt it has been much of a political or let's say even a strategic role in Nepal. And I don't think there is any within the Quad as well. I doubt Japanese strategic interests would come to, let's say, have ramifications in Nepal in this sort of a scenario. But of course, I mean, the larger question about Nepal and the Quad, there will come a moment, or rather, if the situation is as it is, Nepal will have to make tough choices, like you said. And a lot will depend on its leaders on whether they can adeptly play the big players and continue to receive, let's say, the agreements or the grants. But what we've seen from past experience is that if, let's say, in Nepal, inaction can also be seen as a sort of a, let's say, statement. For a long time, let's say, for example, the MCC example that I gave you was the treaty had been submitted to Parliament, but the speaker at the time was someone who was considered to be close to China, which is why Oli made that accusation that the speaker was not allowing the bill to be tabled through. So in this sense, inaction could also be a statement. We've seen that Nepal has not made much progress on BRI agreements as well. There have been infrastructure projects that, as I've said, that have seen rapid progress, Chinese infrastructure projects that have seen rapid progress in Nepal. But under the ambit of BRI itself, 9 projects have been identified. Much of them have not seen any let's say, sort of progress. And these include, I mean, the most recent one, the Damak SEZ, the SEZ in eastern Nepal. Now the BRI itself, China argues, is a very, very fluid idea. Right? Some projects come under it, all projects can come under it, no project can come under it. So, but what we've seen is that Nepal has this sort of ability to, let's say, play the players as well. So whether it can do it to everyone's, let's say, satisfaction, or whether no one is satisfied at all, that is a different question altogether.
Right. Okay, so now I'm just going to open up the Q&A. I'll just read them out to you. So the first question is from Anu Anwar, which is, between China and India, which country's role do you see more aligned to Nepal's national interest? Can Nepal set its own red lights?
Uh, I would say more than China and India. I think Nepal needs to identify its own national interests first. I
Yeah.
mean, it's more interesting that why does it need to choose between two countries as two neighbors? It has good relations with both countries. It has deep civilizational ties with both countries. So it's not a question of say one or the other. I mean, Nepal's interests can lie with both. So I don't think it has to be a particular, let's say, a particular side.
Okay. The next question is from Steve Korzula. With regard to energy, what could be China's role in developing Nepal's hydroelectric potential? Could Nepal export electricity to China, India, both? And how would it impact India's economy?
Now, I'll caveat at the beginning. I am not so clued into the hydroelectricity, the nuances of the hydroelectric, let's say, hydroelectricity investments. What I know is that China has invested heavily in Nepali hydroelectric power plants across the country, but especially in Rasua and Nuwakot. Uh, at the same time, two big investments. One is the Buri Gandaki hydropower, which would have been about 1,000 megawatt plus, and the West Seti hydropower, which is about 650 to 800 megawatt, I believe. Both of these had been, the contracts had been awarded to Chinese companies, and both of them were cancelled because of some, let's say, political issues. So, yes, there is obviously China has a role in developing Nepal's hydroelectricity potential. Could Nepal export electricity to China? That is one of the intended goals. One of the projects listed under BRI is the transmission line to Tibet. But whether it can happen, I am not so sure yet. And would this impact India's economy? I doubt so. I mean, I'm not really sure again because the details would be someone who's more proficient with hydroelectricity, let's say the economy. But what I believe is that right now India has more than adequate power of its own, so it doesn't really need to import power from Nepal. Nepal is in fact talks with Bangladesh to export power to. So if that happens, then it will probably happen overland from India, and that would rather be a game changer for Nepal than, let's say, India's demand or, let's say, China's demand.
Actually, here, because the big power exporter in South Asia is actually Bhutan to India, and now in the region in Nepal's eastern border, along with Sikkim, Bhutan, India, and Bangladesh, the transmission line system and power markets are emerging, which might sort of grow and be a game changer for regional cooperation in that part of South Asia.
Yeah.
The next question is from Dilip Paranjpe. Will Nepal-China relations be a model for other smaller countries in Asia or South Asia like Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, or is it quite distinct?
I think it's a much more distinctive relationship. As I said earlier, the Nepal-China relationship is sort of predicated on Nepal's historical ties with Tibet. And one interesting thing is the Tibetan geography and history is revoked. It's continually invoked in China's, let's say, diplomatic statements and, let's say, in very, very many things when it says in Nepal, but the Tibetan identity is not invoked. So what's happening is that the Nepal's relationship also is not primarily an economic relationship as it is with, let's say, Sri Lanka and Bangladesh. It's more of a political as well as a, let's say, a developing cultural thing built on Nepal's links with Tibet. So it is in that way much more unique. But at the same time, China's ambitions in South Asia are also known. It does seek a greater role in South Asia. So in that sense, it is both, let's say, similar to these other countries in terms of like influence seeking, but also unique in its own way.
Okay. The next question is from Neeraj Shrestha. When you talk of Nepal's historic relationship with China, do you take Nepal's closer relationship with Tibet as part of the relationship with China, or is it distinctive? Just to add to that, for you, to Neeraj's thing is, it's ironic that while the civilizational relationship you refer to has been with Tibet, but Nepal has been actively cracking down on the Tibetans in Nepal over the past 15 years to keep China happy. So in that sense, there's an irony there, no?
No, you're absolutely right. I think while I was researching the book, one of the most interesting quotes, or rather one of the most interesting statements a Tibetan exile told me was that don't ignore a 1,000-year-old history for a 60-year-old friendship. So I think that sort of surmises the thing. A lot of Chinese, let's say, concerns in Nepal do stem from, let's say, Tibetan activism inside Nepal itself. And China also believes that Western countries encourage such activism inside Nepal. So China has obviously applied a lot of pressure on Nepal to clamp down on Tibetan activism. But at the same time, I think like I said earlier, that China also seeks to develop relations with Nepal, keeping the Tibetan geography as well as history in mind. In November 20, just before the pandemic, I went to a trade fair that was uniquely called China's Tibet Trade Fair. So it's sort of emphasizing China's, let's say, sovereignty over Tibet. Nepal believes in the one China policy, all of that officially. So and foreign nationals are not allowed to officially protest inside Nepal. So those are the official positions. Now, as to Neeraj's question, when I talk of Nepal's historic relationship with China, do I take Nepal's closer relationship? I think it's what we have to remember over here is that till 1950, like I said, till 1950, Tibet was Nepal's immediate neighbor. It was only after 1950 that China became Nepal's neighbor. So we have to be able to, let's say, make that distinction between pre-1950 and post-1950 histories. And we have to be also able to make that distinction between, let's say, how Nepal has imagined the North, whether before 1950 it was imagined as Tibet, and after 1950 it was imagined as China. So I think these distinctions have to be made clear. Of course, the political side, the political status of Tibet that's a debate which is not part of this. Let's say, I would not call it part of this book, but it's an interesting place to be in. So Nepal, let's say, imagines Tibet in a very different way now than it had imagined in the past, and a lot of it also had to do with Tibet's relations with Nepal were also, let's say, they were fragmented. They were fragmented across the Himalayan regions where they had, let's say, Tibetan communities on both sides of the mountains. You had ethnic ties, you had familial ties, you had linguistic ties. And in Kathmandu Valley, where, let's say, Newar traders lived for years that stretch in Tibet. But the rest of Nepal did not really know about Tibet. The rest of Nepal, let's say, confronted Tibet or Tibetans only after 1959, when Tibetan refugees started coming into Nepal and living on the, let's say, the outskirts of cities in Kathmandu, in Pokhara. So this sort of distinction, I believe, needs to be made.
Okay. Then we have a question from Lars from Norway and Bulgaria. The question is, China's inroads in Nepal is understood differently in China and in the West, especially in the US, but also in Western Europe. Namely that China argues that it helps Nepal and nothing else. In the West, China's increasing involvement in Nepal and through the BRI globally is seen as aimed at capturing market share, influence, sourcing natural raw materials, etc. But surely the West's involvement in Nepal and in third world countries in general can be seen the same way. He says, I work in development cooperation globally, right now focusing on the hydropower sector in Nepal, and I hear both these stories. What is your view?
This is an interesting question, of course. The more I would say this also a safer answer would be Nepal has to look after its own interests. so whether they are being resolved by, let's say, Western agencies or Western countries, or let's say China, or let's say India, what are Nepali interests first and foremost, whether in development, whether in hydropower, whether in economy, and who is best placed to, let's say, resolve them? Of course, I mean, development finance has its own critique, development agencies have its own critique, Western influence has its own critique. So all of those have, let's say, different positions. But from the Nepali perspective, I believe that it is more important for us to, let's say, have a national goal in mind in terms of what we exactly want from countries, what is our interest, and how are we going to resolve them. So having said that, I think it is quite possible for us to, let's say, work and negotiate with all equally in this. So I hope that answers your question, Lars.
Thanks. Final question from Alicia Khatka. Do you think the ongoing border issue between Nepal and India will worsen the relationship between the two countries in the future? And what role do you believe India will play in Nepalese politics in the future?
In terms of worsening the relationship between Nepal and India because of the border issue, I mean, if you've been following Nepali politics, we can already see that the border issue is already on the back foot. Just today, there was a report that India and Nepal will have agreed to jointly monitor an embankment that India is building on the Mahakali River. So I don't think that the border issue will worsen the relationship. If anything, what India has shown, and what I argued, was that India was willing to discuss these things. India has shown a willingness that has gone to engage with the government in power despite previous crises. And another interesting part of the Nepal-India relationship is also that there have been several crises in the past, and the relationship has, let's say, evolved from those as well. I mean, you had tensions when the Lhasa Kathmandu road was being made. You had tensions when you had tensions in the 1970s when King Birendra declared a zone of peace proposal. You had tensions when Sikkim was annexed by India. But the relationship has evolved beyond all of that. I think as I argued, that because of China's presence in Nepal, and India also knows that China is not going to go anywhere. So I believe there is a reorientation in the works in terms of how India is looking at Nepal, and we can see it in, let's say, India's focus on connectivity, in terms of the infrastructure projects, in terms of the vaccine diplomacy that it has taken. So I don't think there is necessarily you can never predict the future, but I don't see the border issue being as contentious if it continues to be discussed. I don't think it will be as contentious. If it is not discussed, as Nepal has been asking India to do, it will remain a weapon of further political mobilization in the future, at least inside Nepal. So that obviously remains to be there. What role do you believe India will play in Nepalese politics in the future? I'm again, like I said, India has in the past, let's say 6 months to a year, shown a willingness to engage both with the democratic government in Nepal as well as a government that had dissolved the parliament. So like I said, is it perhaps just keeping sight of its long-term interests without actually thinking about, okay, we don't want to be so visible politically at this moment? I really don't know. But yes, India will continue to play a role in Nepal in the future, because of obviously the bilateral relationship is such. I mean, you have an open border, you have several, let's say, economic interlinkages, cultural linkages. So I don't see that going away for sure.
So Amish, thank you so much for I know it's late, like for you, and for sharing your thoughts and your deep
knowledge. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Just a last question before we allow you to go is, so what is your next project?
For now, if I could travel a little bit, that would be pretty good.
When can we invite you back? When you will tell us something new?
No. No, as of now, I mean, we're not really thinking of anything as of now, because obviously we're seeing a second wave here in South Asia. So
Is
as of
it,
now,
is
we're
it
pretty much
bad in
at home.
Kathmandu too?
Yeah, we are seeing cases rise. I mean, till last month, we had come down to about 80, 90 cases a day. Now they've risen back to about like 260, 200. Yesterday was 260 a day. So we are seeing a rise, because obviously, again, this is where the open border comes into play. India, the number of cases are rising, and therefore they will not rise at the same time in Nepal. What will happen is that India cases are rising. The migrants, those Nepalis who are working in Nepal, in India, they will come back home, and that's why there has been increased testing at the borders now. So these are the sort of impacts that the open border also has, so for now I think we will be here, but hopefully we'll travel soon, and then we can think of something. So
Lovely. Thank you again, and we hope
thank
we
you
can
so
have
much.
you back again soon.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Professor Kapoor. Thank you so
Sure.
much.
Bye-bye.
All right.
Thank you all
Bye.
for
Good night.
joining us.